We're speaking with Rashid Khalidi, author of numerous books, most recently Sowing Crisis, the Cold War and American Dominance in the Middle East. Thanks for talking with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could just start off by maybe providing us a little bit of a summary of what the most recent book is about in terms of what you think is new, in particular, that you bring to light in terms of what role the Cold War played in determining what was happening in the Middle East.
Well, one of the things I'm trying to show is how important the Middle East was during the Cold War. We think of the Cold War as Berlin or a nuclear standoff or possibly the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and those were sort of the central arenas of the Cold War, but the Middle East was a very, very important place where the superpowers were engaged. The second thing we think about when we think about the Cold War is how it affected us, the United States, or how it might have affected the Soviets. We pay much less attention to those places where the Cold War was fought out, places like the Middle East. So the second thing that I try and do in this book is talk about the impact of the Cold War on the Middle East and the way the Cold War looked from the Middle East, how regional actors saw the superpowers. So those are the things that I try and look at in this book.
You make towards the end of the book, you make the statement that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has been quite striking that crisis in the Middle East region and the adjacent ones have appeared harder to isolate and more closely entwined with one another. Right. Say a little bit more about what you mean by
that.
Right.
This is actually something I will be talking about in my talk. This is one of the most important conclusions I think I came to, and it has to do with the fact that during the Cold War, the different crises that the superpowers were involved in were sort of compartmentalized. So, for example, during the 1973 war, there was a nuclear alert. The Soviet Union put some forces on alert. The United States put forces on alert. But that crisis was contained. And the same was true with other Cold War crises in other arenas. So you would have something in the Gulf. It wouldn't have much effect on the Arab-Israeli arena. You'd have something in Afghanistan and so on. One of the things that I've noticed about the post-Cold War era, the last 20 years or so, is that these crises seem to be more and more interlinked. What the United States does in Iraq affects the Arab-Israeli arena. What's happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan affects Iran and Iraq and so on. And so we have a series of things that are much more closely linked than they were during the Cold War era. And in a time when there are fewer rules, the United States has no real rivals the way it did with the Soviet Union. But at the same time, there's not this system that sort of governs what you can and can't do. It's a sort of a free-for-all. So you have a situation where there is no real rival, but there are various dangers and issues out there, and these crises seem to be more and more linked.
Would you say, though, that to some degree the way that maybe some media pundits and to some degree maybe politicians might frame it is that there is a rival, and they might say that it's Islam, or it's Arab nationalism possibly, but particularly Islam. I mean, how do you respond to that claim that the U.S. does have a rival in sort of creating, stability in the region because of Islam?
Well, some people would say Arab nationalism, some people would say Islam, some people would say Islamic terrorism or terrorism, some people would say Islamo-fascism. I would argue that all of these things are not real. I don't really think these are bogeymen, these are constructs. The United States has a problem with specific terrorist organizations, a couple. They don't represent Islam any more than some crazy guy with a gun in some part of the United States represents everybody of his religion or her religion. And they really don't represent. I mean, they don't have any support. They are isolated in their own societies. I mean, you go to a place like Pakistan. The Pakistani Taliban, all the Pakistani Muslim parties get 15% of the vote. So what are we talking about? Do we want to identify with a tiny minority the entirety of that society and turn them into our enemies by saying all of Islam is our enemy? We can do that. If we're blind and stupid and we don't understand and we don't realize that these people are extremely unpopular in their own societies, then of course we're perfectly capable of creating enemies. And to some extent I think the United States went ahead and did this. There was no particular enmity towards the United States on the part of most Iraqis before we invaded and occupied their country. Now most of them want us out and hate us. Well, we created that problem. There was no enemy in Iraq for the United States. There was a terrible government, which the United States overthrew. But most Iraqis didn't dislike the United States one bit. We now have a bit of a problem there. I would say the same thing is to some extent true in other parts of the Muslim world, that there is no particular enmity for the United States in some places, except people don't like our policies, or they don't really want us in their countries. And then there are other problems that to some extent we're not responsible for creating, which are internal problems to some of these countries. Like, say, Egypt, a country where we support a very repressive government, and a lot of people are resentful about that. But the problems of Egypt are the problems of Egypt. It's not the fault of the United States.
Right. Well, so since there's no recognizable sort of, enemy here in a sense, it seems that the U.S. has been acting unilaterally since the end of the Cold War. What do you think? I mean, there seems to be some rhetorical differences between the Obama administration, the Bush administration, but on the ground in terms of real hard policies, what differences have you seen? Do you think even though we're only 9 months into the new administration?
Well, I would make a distinction between the last Bush administration and both the Obama administration and the two administrations that preceded it. In other words, I think that the way that the first President Bush and President Clinton, and to the extent we can assess him, President Obama, have tried to deal with the world was and is much less unilateral than was the case with George W. Bush and his administration. If you look at the coalition that the first President Bush and Secretary of State Baker put together to fight the first Gulf War, I mean, they could have gone in there like a bunch of cowboys and just knocked Saddam Hussein's army out of Kuwait all by their lonesome, and tooted their horn and done whatever they wanted to do, and had somebody like Rumsfeld yelling about stuff. They didn't. They did a low-key, intelligently organized coalition run through the United Nations. There were many flaws in what was done, but it was not unilateral, and it was thoroughly successful in its objectives. I have many criticisms of both the first Bush administration and the Clinton administration, but they were much less unilateral than was the second Bush, the George W. Bush administration. Now, it's early days to talk about the Obama administration. Here we are in September. They've been in office since the end of January. They still have half of their senior people are not even confirmed by the Senate. Right. So they're running on 2 wheels or 3 wheels, really. But to the extent to which you can judge them, they seem to have somewhat more of a multilateral approach than did the previous administration. On the other hand, they've inherited a couple problems where I don't really see a huge distinction between their policies and those of the Bush administration. The Bush administration was already withdrawing from Iraq. So, this administration may withdraw a little quicker, but it's not necessarily, I don't see a huge difference. And I don't see a great willingness to rethink the paradigm, to rethink some of the things that have always been the basis of the American presence in Iraq. But the big problem is Afghanistan. And there I have yet to see a complete rethinking of what the United States is doing there. Because it's pretty clear, I mean, General McChrystal is saying it, everything, that what has been done in the past 8 years hasn't worked very well. We're not winning, and the Taliban are winning. So that's not a success. Whatever was done didn't work. I don't yet see an enormous willingness to rethink that from the ground up. And I have to say the same thing for the Arab-Israeli peace process. They haven't made some of the mistakes that the second Bush administration, George W. Bush's administration made. But in spite of a change in rhetoric, I haven't seen a huge breakthrough yet in terms of policies. It may be early days, but time is of the essence on this. You really don't want to be dealing with Arab-Israeli peace issues in the last year of your first term or the last year of your second term. And that's what both the Bush and the Clinton administrations did in the 8th year that each of those presidents was in office, and that was that's catastrophically foolish. So if you don't move it in the first couple of years that you're in office, you're probably not going to get stuff done.